In this video, I want to talk with you about something that happens in counterfeit churches, a misunderstanding regarding marriage. I personally grew up in a family and a religion. Many of you know that I grew up Mormon. And the implication for me, or the expectation for me, was always that I was going to basically get married and have a lot of kids. I don't think there's anything wrong with getting married and having a lot of kids. So I want to just be clear about that. I think that's a beautiful thing, and it is such an honor to be a parent, to be a mother, to be a father, and to bring God's children into this world and to raise them up to Him. So I don't want anyone to misunderstand my message today. Having children is a blessing, and raising them to God, knowing God at the time that you have children, knowing Christ at the time that you have children, and raising them up to Him, that is such a beautiful thing. It is an honor and it has great reward. But there's something that happens in counterfeit Christianity, and that is that people who are single, people who do not marry, who, by the way, there's nothing wrong with them that they're not marrying. If God wanted them to marry, He would have them be married. He would make a way for them to be married. And the thing that we need to understand is they've not been set apart for that. They've not been set apart to get married by God, not by some inadequacy, not by some inferiority. In fact, if you remember, Paul wrote the majority of the New Testament books. He was single. He knew he was going to remain single. He spoke with others about remaining single unless you are really burning with passion and you need to get married, then get married. But he talked to people about this idea that when you're married, you're focused on the other person and you become focused on worldly things. When you're single, you're able to stay single-minded to Christ, and your anxieties on a daily basis are for Him, are for what you're doing for Him, because He's your husband. And so I truly believe that there has been a satanic strategy and a satanic ideas and attitudes toward marriage, toward being single, that have really infected the church. And we need to get clear on this. There's nothing wrong with someone who is single. They have been set apart to be single. And in many cases, their purpose is extremely important. In Scripture, Christ said that there are those who are born eunuchs, there are those who were made that way by man, and there are those who live as eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Those who can accept this way of life should. That's the wording he used. So there is actually great honor in being single and single-minded for Christ and living only to please Him. Don't misunderstand. There's not a sin that you're committing in being married or even wanting to be married. But we still have to take Scripture at its word. We still have to look at the examples, such as Paul, such as Jesus, of those who remained single because their anxiety was only for the Lord. Their desire was only for the Lord. I am one who lives like a eunuch, I am not going to get married. I have not been in a relationship since the Father drew me to the Son. He made His purpose known very clearly to me that I was not going to be getting married, that I was to be single-minded for Him. Now, I also want to say, don't mistake this for what the Catholic Church does in preaching celibacy. This is not about not having sex. That's a product of not being in a relationship, in a marriage. This is not about that, though. This is about my heart being strictly for God and for the purpose for which He has set me apart. So when I was being raised Mormon, they had a lot of events for single people. Part of the goal, it seemed, this wasn't a stated goal, but definitely part of the culture was that it was understood that you were going to get married and you were going to replenish the earth and, populate and have lots of kids. And so part of the culture was really focused on bringing people together for the purpose of marriage. So there were a lot of singles events. They even had what was called a singles ward, WARD, so a singles service. Quite frankly, I don't find that to be scriptural, because part of what, and we're going to get into reading this in the scriptures, but part of what Paul says is that however you came in is how you should stay. It's not a sin to get married, but all of this focus on marriage and this implication that you're somehow deficient or insufficient or inadequate or somehow unusual because you're not getting married, those implications are satanic. And you need to know that that does not just occur in Mormonism, that occurs in counterfeit Christianity as a whole. That there is this idea that you are supposed to get married. And if you don't, something's wrong. When I was baptized into a quote-unquote Christian church, a counterfeit Christian church, years later when I was in graduate school, one of my friends who was very involved in kind of making me a project to get baptized, I remember asking her about the small group that she was in. And she said to me, "Oh, no, this is for married people." And that was the end of the conversation. No discipleship, no conversation about, hey, there's another kind of small group. It was more of like sort of a shame that I wasn't married, an exclusion. And the fact that there was no more conversation about that, the way that I took that was, oh, okay, then that's what I need to continue working towards, and then I'll be included. So it was a continuation of this counterfeit doctrine, this counterfeit attitude and culture that I experienced in Mormonism and again was experiencing in counterfeit Christianity. And I will share with you that attitude, as I would, because that was what I grew up with, having been a single parent, I always felt like I wasn't complete. My home was not complete unless there was a man. And so that only fed this idolatry of, gotta find a man, gotta find a man. And as a result, it also significantly lowered my standards. And really, when you're entering into Christianity, when you're entering into being of Christ, your standards should be lifted, not lowered. But in an effort to fulfill and become complete, which is what I was learning in counterfeit Christianity, I felt maybe I was being too picky. Maybe I needed to lower my standards. And we see a version of this satanic trick in the world, even in the world within counterfeit Christianity, in which people are going online and they're trying to find a partner, especially if they're a woman and they're older, because the clock is ticking on that other piece that counterfeit Christianity tells us that we must do, which is to have children. That is also not biblical. We are supposed to replenish the earth. If we are in a marriage, then yes, we need to replenish the earth. But if we've not been set apart for that, it doesn't mean that we haven't been set apart for something very important. So it's not a secret that those who go, resort to online dating are placed in a position oftentimes because the dating pool is so muddy that they're lowering their standards in order to hurry up and accomplish this goal. I really strongly have beliefs against doing online dating and against going out and trying to find your own partner. There are people who claim to be Christian, such as Dr. Pat Allen, who tell people to go out and just flirt with everybody, practice flirting, even with married men. Even with married men. This is coming straight out of the mouth of a Catholic. And these are very destructive teachings. That is a destructive teaching for obvious reasons. Christ does not call you to go out and be a temptress. But the problem is that when your focus starts to be on doing this by the work of your hands and something that you have to make happen, you lose focus on who is actually choosing your spouse. If he wants you to be married, then you'll be married. If he doesn't want you to be married, it doesn't matter how much dating you do, you're not going to be married. Doesn't matter how much flirting you do. In fact, all of that is going to take you down a road of vulnerability. The truth is that we need to be focused on what God has set us apart for. If he hasn't set us apart to be married, then we need to work our heart into accepting that. And so he's the one that we're supposed to be going to. And what's happening is that people are going online and they're spending so much time going on dates and talking to people and all of this other stuff, and it's just one big distraction. God's going to let you know. He's perfectly capable of putting you in a position where you meet the person that he has destined you to meet. He doesn't need to utilize online dating or anything else of the world in order to accomplish his will. So the attitude that I want to talk with you about here is one of understanding and pursuing and seeking God's will, not anybody else's will or what counterfeit Christianity says. And I had thought about making this video for single people and putting that in the title, but this needs to be said on both sides. If you have this attitude that you're supposed to be married and that you somehow have arrived, or that being married and having children is a more important purpose than what God has set apart single people to do, you're going to damage other people. You're going to hurt other people. You're going to alienate them and yourself potentially, and you're not speaking in truth. You're not believing the truth. Ultimately, the marriage covenant that God is most focused on is the marriage covenant that we have with him. So Paul says, even if we are married, we're supposed to be focused on that covenant that we have with him primarily. So let's get into the word and see what Paul actually says so that we can have good understanding about what God desires from us with regard to married life or with regard to being single. But no matter what, the number one covenant that we are focused on that is going to direct our paths, whether we're single or we're married, is the covenant that we have with Christ. 1 Corinthians 7. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Now, what is Paul saying when he says that? I wish that all of you were as I am. Paul was single. He did not get married, and he was single-minded for God, and we're going to see that as the scripture goes on. That's going to be clarified. But I want to pause here to take a look at what he's saying. I wish all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift and another has that. Maybe your gift is bringing in children to this world and raising them up to God. Maybe part of your gift as well is demonstrating having a godly relationship and demonstrating that to those who are witnessing you. So part of what Paul is saying here is don't put your gift as higher than anyone else's. And the word tells us that even if something is higher, right? Prophecy is more important than speaking in tongues, for example. Even if your gift is more useful in the kingdom, that doesn't mean you're going to lord it over someone. It doesn't mean you're going to start alienating people and humiliating them because they don't have the same gift you have. And in fact, in this particular situation, Paul is saying, I wish you were like me so you could be single-minded for God. And Jesus is saying, if you choose, those of you who can live like a eunuch, who can accept that way of life, should. So they're already setting that up as a higher standard. You understand? That's the reality of it. And so, of course, Satan is going to come in and try to wipe that away and make the single person who's living for God, who's completely circumcised to him, consecrated to him. Of course, Satan's going to make that a reason for them to be alienated and excluded, and for them to feel bad, for them to be left out, or for them to feel pressure. But the word says that unmarried life is good. Unmarried life, those who can accept it should, because that will allow them to be single-minded for Christ. And again, you're going to see that Paul continues to say, look, it's not a sin. Don't misunderstand. It's not a sin to be married. But those who can accept that should. So no one should be treating anybody differently. I'm not lording this over you. Wasn't lording this over anyone. He was simply explaining, here's the deal. Verse 8. Now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it's good for them to stay unmarried as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So again, he clarified what his status is when he said that I wish you were all like me. Now he's saying it's good for them to stay unmarried as I do. So he's clarifying his status. But he's also saying if they can't accept this way of life, if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, because it's better for them to marry than to burn with passion. To the unmarried, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he's willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. You understand that, right? Because the couple they are one. As long as they're together, they are one. And whatever comes from that holy union continues to make the offspring clean. However, if that union should become separated and there's a believing spouse and an unbelieving spouse, or no longer a spouse, now that child is no longer under one sanctified unit. Now the child has become unclean. I realize that that is a difficult teaching to accept, but you have to consider what that child is now going to be taught in separate households by separate parents. Nevertheless, we know that the sins of a parent are not going to condemn us. We know that if a child comes from an unrighteous or a wicked parent, that they are going to live or die based on whether or not they turn to righteousness or they turn to sin. Verse 17. Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. Two things here that are important: that they should live as a believer, and a believer is primarily concerned about the covenant that they have with Christ. And the second thing is that Paul refers to the situation that the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. You think you got married because that was your decision? Well, that's not what the word says. The word says that that's the situation you've been called to. You think the single person is single because they've chosen to be single? That's not what the word says. The word says that's the situation that God has called them to. God is perfectly capable of giving you the self-control and the capacity to make the decision based on what he's set you apart for to stay single. If that's what he has chosen for you, he's perfectly capable of putting you in that situation and equipping you with the ability to obey, just as he's done with me. I had a lifetime of pursuing this belief that I had to be married. It was an incredible longing, an insatiable longing, I would even say, and even more accurately, an insatiable compulsion that stood in the way of my relationship with God and even my ability to be the mother that I wanted to be, because I didn't think I could be the mother I wanted to be unless I had a husband. I didn't think my home was going to be complete. So how is it possible that God brought me to a place where not only is that not a compulsion, but I fully accept this way of life? He has the ability to put me in the position to be in the situation that he has assigned to me, that he has called me to be in. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Now let me explain when God called them. What he's talking about is when the Father draws you to the Son, and then the Son proves himself to you, that's when he's calling you. Whatever situation you're in at that time is the situation that you should remain in. Verse 21, were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. Similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. So even though this is separated into paragraphs and chapters and whatever else, you need to understand that this is a continual conversation. One paragraph has to do with the other. It's a continued conversation. So he's continuing to talk with you about this topic of marriage. Just because he doesn't say if you were married when he called you, that's the situation you should stay in, or if you were unmarried when he called you, that's the situation you should stay in. It's implied. It's a continuous conversation. Now he continues to say that if you're burning with passion, go marry. If you're betrothed, go marry. It's not a sin. It's not a sin to marry. But let me ask you something. A church that is having singles events like this, or singles wards, singles congregations, does that make any sense? Because the implication there is that you got to work for whatever it is that you're deeming to be the position that you're called to be the position, the situation that God has assigned you to. God does not say go out there and pursue. You're supposed to pursue him and the will that he has for your life, the situation to which he has assigned you. So that is a part of counterfeit Christianity that I believe is incredibly destructive and totally misleading. If you are not meeting someone, it just might be that that's not what God has set you apart for, that that's not the situation that he's chosen for you. You don't need to control that by the work of your own hands. If you believe that God is the one who brings you together with the one he's chosen for you, then that's what you need to seek, is what situation have you set me apart to be in, Lord? And in this way, you're not going to toil over trying to find a partner. You're not going to waste time that you should be spending with God dating in a cesspool. He's perfectly capable of bringing you together with a partner if that's what he's chosen for you. Your job is to receive from him whether he has chosen that for you or not. And don't think it's fate. Don't think it's love at first sight. You know, all of these things that the world talks about, it's either God or it's not. He gets the glory, not fate, not destiny, not anything else. He gets the glory. I know a couple who were put in a situation by God in which they were in a country, a foreign country, studying abroad, and everyone around them had alienated them for weird reasons. And so they were forced to spend all of this time together, and they became the best of friends, built a solid relationship, and got married, and now they're having a baby. That's what God is capable of doing. God did that. He knew what he was doing. He knew the situation that he had assigned to them. He knew how to conform everything for his will. That's not fate. That's not destiny. That's God. And God did something with me. I can pretty much tell you the exact point at which I could not get a man to even look at me. And I know it's not because I was ugly or hideous or something like that. It wasn't. It was not because of that. I was still attractive. And when it really comes down to it, men of the world will look at anything. They don't care whether it's attractive or not. But there was a marked period where God did something to where I could not even get a man to look at me. It was like he put a mark on me. And I indeed believe that 100%, that he put a mark on me so that I could not be touched, so that I could no longer be led away from him. I thought that was so interesting because never in my life had I ever had that situation where I could not attract a man. That's not me. That's God. That's not chance. That's not destiny. That's not fate. That is God. He made that decision. He isolated me to himself, and he brought me into the situation that he has assigned to me. And then he talked with me about that situation. And then he worked with me regarding that situation so that my heart was no longer going astray, so that my heart was only for him. And I remember very clearly that when he started talking to me, I remember feeling all of that loneliness and that plague of needing someone. I remember saying to him, this is all I've ever needed. This is all I've ever needed. If you just don't leave me, if you just stay with me, I can do anything. I don't need a relationship. I don't need anything. If you just stay with me, I can do whatever you tell me to do. And that's right. I can do whatever he tells me to do. He will make a way. And he proved that to me, because no one can give me that feeling that Christ gives me. No one knows how to fulfill me in the way that I need to be fulfilled, in the way that I didn't know that I needed all of my life. Verse 25, now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who, by the Lord's mercy, is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as they do not. Those who mourn as if they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. Those who buy something as if it's not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away. I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way, in undivided devotion to the Lord. Understand that he's not just talking about men, he's also talking to women. So you can hear that very clearly here. And a lot of times the attitude is that it's not a big deal for a man not to be married, but it's terrible for a woman not to be married. Now, don't get me wrong. I've heard plenty of men tell me stories about feeling alienated and having this same attitude and treatment within counterfeit Christianity. But generally in the world, it does seem to lean more heavily on the woman that there's something wrong with her if she's not married. And this scripture very clearly is indicating that Paul is talking to both men and women, suggesting, recommending that they not get married if they can accept that way of life. Verse 36, if anyone is worried that he might not be acting honorably toward the virgin he is engaged to, and if his passions are too strong and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He's not sinning. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does better. So Paul is setting up one situation to be better than the other. So why do we have this attitude in counterfeit Christianity that the lower situation is better than the other? I'll tell you why, because it's counterfeit Christianity. It's counterfeit doctrine, it is satanic, and it is intended to cause you to not understand what is important to the heart of God, to make marriage and relationship an idol, rather than putting it in its proper perspective and understanding that the marriage that you have first is with God. And the second reason why this satanic ideology has been planted is in order to demean those who are actually picking up the situation that Christ has called them to which they have been assigned, which is actually, I can tell you from personal experience, it's quite difficult. It's quite difficult because those of you who are married have someone to talk to about what you're going through. I don't. Paul didn't. They didn't have a human partner in those moments when God is not speaking or when they're not feeling connected to God, a human partner to encourage, to reaffirm, to help validate. They don't have that. I don't have that. And so when people who are living this are being treated in an inferior and an excluded or alienated way, it's quite discouraging. You know, I've even had people who I worked with who, once they found out that I was not married, treated me with less respect. And I had to call them on it simply because they found out that I was not married. But the truth is that if someone is choosing to live this way, it is because this is the situation that's been assigned to them by God, and their purpose just might be incredibly important, and their sacrifice is huge. It's a huge sacrifice. Just because it's the situation to which you've been assigned doesn't make it any less of a sacrifice. The fact that Christ was assigned to be the sacrificial lamb, does that mean it's any less of a sacrifice? He still had to go through all the feelings when he was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, those feelings that we see that he was feeling, the prayer that he was saying, let this cup pass from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. What I'm doing every single day with God could not be done if I had a husband. I would be concerned about him. I would be engaging in certain work and chores that needed to be done for him. God set me apart for this. God put me in this situation. He called me to the situation that he assigned me. And that assignment comes with a lot of sacrifice, a lot of pouring out, a lot of pain. And yes, I have God to go to, and he is my husband. And anytime that I was struggling with this and said to him, you haven't given me a husband, don't think I'm not above saying that. Anytime that I've said that to him, he has literally responded to me, would you like to trade me in? Because I'm the one providing for you. I'm the one doing these things. I'm the one being this husband to you. And he snapped me right back into position when he said that to me. But don't misunderstand. The relationship that I have with God is very deep. It's very strong. His power, his presence rests on me. He bestows wisdom that I don't hear anybody talking about, but it has the same twists and turns that your relationship with him has. There are times that he withholds from me and requires me to work on strengthening my faith and reminding myself of who he is and what he's done. It's not the same thing as having a physical husband who's present here, who I can talk with, and I know that I can call him up on the phone. It's hard, you guys. It's hard. Anyone who's living that knows that it is hard. It is a sacrifice. And even though this is the situation that he has assigned, to which he has assigned me, there's still choices there, right? I could still, disobey him and go out there and try to find someone, bang my head against that wall again, have momentary, companionship. But I do make the choice on a daily basis that Christ is my husband. This is the situation to which he's called me. I know that because he's spoken with me about it. And I make the conscious decision on a daily basis that I'm going to wake up and I'm going to start the breaking process, the crushing process, to bring myself into position so that I can receive, so that I can share, so that I can do what he set me apart to do. So let's not assume what anybody's assignment is. Let's not assume that those who are not married are going to somehow come into your, small group and seduce your husband. Because that's another thing that happens in counterfeit Christianity, where women who are single are treated like some sort of Jezebel or something. They've always got to be monitored if they're with a man. Don't let them near my husband. I mean, that's ridiculous. That is ridiculous. Everyone has responsibility over themselves. If anyone's that concerned about their spouse straying from the marriage, they need to work on that with God. Verse 39, a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she's free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord. In my judgment, she's happier if she stays as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. All right, that's the end of this chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians. The bottom line that I want to share with you is don't assume anyone else's assignment. Don't alienate or humiliate anyone in the body of Christ. And understand this with the proper perspective. Anyone who has picked this up, anyone who is living in this position that's been given to them by God, they are making a choice to receive that from God. It is actually the higher position. So don't assume that that marriage somehow, human marriage is somehow better than being single. That's not even biblical. And perhaps you might even look at those who've made this decision with God with a little respect, with a little bit of admiration, with a little honor. Thank you for listening. God bless you. And I'll see you in the next video.